Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to review Power Rangers Dino Thunder. So, going into this review, man, do I really enjoy Dino Thunder? Recently, yeah, there might be like an episode here or there that is kind of clunky or kind of has a weird concept to it or this and that. But when looking at it for most of these first 15 episodes, like, I didn't think that there was yet one story that felt recycled or felt like filler episode or something that I couldn't ultimately get behind the story at some point in time. Because also knowing that these stories were pretty much written for a younger audience. Going into this, basically there's only probably out of 15 episodes, there's probably one episode where ultimately it's probably a bad episode just because really it's just reiterating every single season of the Power Rangers and then eventually supposedly having a small-ish like story that otherwise ties us upon a episode, but it's not really good enough. Like, basically it's Tommy held hostage and basically there's not enough there. So, going into this episode, or going into these 15 episodes, very much meaning, we go into here and reasonably, we have a slighter adjustment of Power Rangers because some seasons there seems to be, of course, only 3 at first, and then eventually there is additions that are being done later. Going into this, it is kind of interesting to see Tommy back after a long stretch of time, and knowing full well he is the more veteran Power Ranger that is ultimately going to tell people how to do things, because a lot of people don't understand or don't know. Ultimately, there might be a lot of people that ultimately do not care for Tommy being in this show whatsoever as far as a Power Ranger, because for how longevity he's been in here. Some people have some mixed feelings about Tommy. I honestly enjoy the character. I love Jason David Frank. And ultimately, every single time I see him, like, yeah, there's some times where I think he is, like, boasted as the greatest thing since sliced bread sometimes. But recently, it's just because he's been there the longest. Like, he's probably everyone's favorite just because of the Green Ranger. The original iteration of this character was so good, especially the villainous evil story that he had. Still to this day is probably way better than a lot of other stories that we've had through any number of story iterations and stuff like that. And I think a lot of times, a lot of stories have forcibly backpedaled and tried to consistently do that through years upon years and years. Every single time you usually have a 6th Power Ranger, normally he is presented at first as a villain, but then eventually he will go into very much being a ally or a resource that they can eventually use. Because ultimately they talk him into very much coinciding onto their side. So, justifiably, we have into these 15 episodes, and eventually if people like this review, maybe I'll do more. There's just a ton of stuff to comb through through some portions of some seasons. Ultimately, I hope people could know surefire well how much I emphatically enjoy this season. I think reasonably, Mighty Morphin was great to me because it was basically my childhood, and ultimately Dino Thunder is good to me because it gives me back to those same feels. It kind of has the same exact beats as Mighty Morphin, and reasonably it kind of very much almost copies and pastes a little bit things here and there to really just go into like it feeling like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. We ultimately have I also like SPD, which I think is a great season. I think it's great. I liked SPD. It was fun. But yeah, those are like probably my top three, and then everything else is just kind of like, well, I think I liked it. I think I enjoyed it. I think I had a good time. I think Power Rangers Samurai is a good season, but I think Super Samurai is just a mess. It's just there's some bad episodes in there, some bad episodes, but ultimately, like people, like at least they tried. So, anyways, justifiably, let's ultimately, because now I'm just kind of like spitting out a bunch of other seasons and stuff like that. I kind of have to tailor back into Dino Thunder. So, reasonably, we have like a very like diverse Power Ranger characters. Basically, we have it to where there's specific themes. Like I think at some point had probably gotten done because recently when looking at it, like there's not so many wheels that you can invent in this Power Rangers. Like okay, like we have of course Kira, who is of course the Yellow Ranger, and she is just the singing songwriter artist. We have Connor, who is the Red Ranger, who is a soccer player, and then we have Ethan, who is of course the brains behind the whole thing. He's basically the computer nerd, which is kind of funny to have Connor like basically consistently quipping Ethan to tell him it's like whenever Ethan is just like giving Connor crap, Connor in turn is telling him it's like, well, like man, why would you even want to be here? Wouldn't you want to be behind a computer somewhere, like hacking into some place and this and that? Like the funny little banter between one another, I think, is kind of hilarious. So, and then eventually we get into having not only Tommy fully fledgedly on this show as a Power Ranger, but then we ultimately have Trent, who is the White Ranger, which ultimately they kind of play like the sixth Ranger card for Trent, but ultimately still I thought that his introduction to this was kind of fun. It was just really fun. So we ultimately have villains, of course, in this show. We of course have Mesagog, which kind of looks like a dinosaurish character himself, and we have Elsa, who is portraying herself as the school principal, and then we have Zeltrax, which he's kind of like the Goldar Esh-like character of this show. I am kind of interested to figuring out how exactly this character could see, because it looks like his helmet is just like, how could you be able to see with that thing on? It looks impossible, as well as any number of probably villains that are put into this show, because like their costumes like look to where it's like, how can you even see with that thing? Or more than likely, probably they couldn't, and they were just like trying their best. So anyways, going into this season is overwhelmingly fun. It maybe probably does at some point have some clunky like episodes. Recently, eventually we get to a big story going on with Tommy, which we ultimately just barely within 15 episodes kind of scratched the surface of. There being eventually a time where Tommy is eventually going to have a big story arc like moment, which is really the best thing about this show. I think people more so go back to that episode more so than go back to this series, sadly enough. Because ultimately, Tommy has a huge, kind of come to fruition like moment about him needing to fight old ghosts. And so eventually, I'm not going to talk about that. Eventually, I'll talk about that when we get to that episode if people enjoy this review enough for me to continue. talking about Dino Thunder. So, yeah, going into this, that's all I wanted to say about this show in a very cryptic-like sense. Let's break down into spoiler-like sense and really just talk about how I just thoroughly enjoy the show. I think, if anything, they cleverly do their command center in this season. They kind of do it cleverly, but then again, it also comes to be like an odd moment. And I'll explain why in spoilers. Because ultimately, when looking at it, it comes down as kind of like copying and pasting from some other kind of character. Anyways, the thing that I always harper back on when I look into this series is the point in time when Kira on Operation Overdrive goes and is teamed up with Adam, who is, of course, Johnny Young Bosch. And ultimately, he is like talking to Kira, like basically after they've wrapped up their whole fighting and villain taking down. And basically, Kira talks about how she has worked with Dr. Tommy Oliver, and ultimately, Adam is like, Tommy's a doctor? like I don't buy that for 1 second. Like, no. Like, I just find that hilarious how, like, basically, like, Adam is throwing shade to Tommy, knowing full well that at some point Adam was supposed to be the new Tommy once he was growing out his hair and for Turbo, and basically what ended up happening was just that Johnny just decided, like, well, if I'm not going to be the Red Ranger, then maybe I should just go and just leave. And that's what I'm assuming was happening, was just the fact that, like, Johnny was probably left to be the most veteran-ish like character, and why wasn't he going to be eventually the Red Ranger? So I guess maybe after that he was just like, well, I'm done. I'm leaving. Like, I'm gone. Because I think at that point they weren't going into changing anybody's colors or stuff like that. So I guess reasonably, since they didn't want to give Adam the Red Ranger color, I guess that's when he just decided to just, like, well, like, sayonara, sadly enough. But ultimately, Johnny has come back numerous times as the Black Ranger, and I thought that was really fun. It would be great to have, like, a Forever Green episode where you have all the Green Rangers and stuff like that, which ultimately maybe there is probably an episode somewhere like that where you just have every single blue or green or whatever color Rangers that eventually come back. Because eventually I would love to just see David Yost come back onto this show as somebody somewhere somehow. Because we were ultimately hoping that the Phantom Ranger would have maybe been David Yost, but ultimately it ends up being that the reveal of that character never happened. So anyways, going into this, as I'm going on several tangents, but, like, I wanted to have that kind of closure moment of letting everybody know there's an episode of Operation Overdrive where you have a Dino Thunder character that ultimately is tied to a very interesting, like, team that kind of gives us a closure moment of this series. So, and ultimately, I don't know if there's any other things that happen after that. I'm sure there probably is a number of episodes where there's probably some, like, guest appearance of somebody somewhere that did something. But anyways, going into this, let's go into spoilers about this episode. Let's dust out that double 5 to otherwise mention about this series, because at the end of the day, I enjoyed it. It was a fun thing. It was a fun thing to go into. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So, the very beginning of this, we have it to where we just have a lot of kids that are utterly defiant. We have it to where Ethan is setting off a fire alarm, which of course gets him into detention because he's the only kid walking around school with a umbrella on, seemingly knowing full well that that is going to kind of say that he is a villain of this prank. We ultimately have Connor, who is pushing to have one kid stay a little bit longer because he wants to do some practice, and ultimately, this kid is mentioning, well, the principal does want us to do this, and like Connor is just like, well, like I don't care what she says, like I want to practice more, and ultimately that's what is led Connor to get into some hot water because ultimately he's doing setting up business for himself. We have it to where ultimately Kira is just an artist who I think is consistently wanting to twiddle around with her guitar, and so by and large, Elsa, the principal, is coming in to eventually just like put a taper down into this person that is wanting to play with her guitar, and that's all that matters to her. Eventually Kira mentions to Elsa that it's like, well, hey, like, do you realize that anybody who would usually go on to play an instrument eventually ends up getting a scholarship? So hey, maybe you should like lighten up about this whole like guitar playing. So Elsa, of course, ends up sending all three of these characters to the detention um, for just being anarchists. So we eventually have it to where within this school we have a brand new teacher called Dr. Tommy Oliver. Weirdly and bizarrely, they find out that Elsa realizes that it's like, yeah, we don't have a lot of information about this Tommy Oliver character. It seems like his Angel Grove records were sealed. And so why is it that we can't find any information on this character? It's like, well, his records are sealed, we can't get that information. So, like, so interestingly enough, like, we have a character that that reasonably we find out 7 years prior had gone in and to attack a bunch of Mesagogs like minions, and ultimately had ran away from eventually getting caught by Mesagog's minions. Now we find out that person was, of course, Tommy. And so going into this, we have it to where Tommy is ultimately forcibly having to take these kids into detention. And he's like, well, I would have actually liked to go into a museum so ultimately I can kind of found out what happened within this museum. And so ultimately the principal tells him to send the kids with him. So forcibly he has to go and take these kids on a journey to this museum, and all the while finding out that Tommy is looking at this museum and it is supposedly closed permanently, and that he needs to call some person that I believe no longer is alive or exists. So eventually Tommy ends up walking around the grounds of this museum and ends up finding a dinosaur that is really, of course, utterly alive. And so justifiably, Tommy is eventually just running away. And at first, he goes and does like a roundhouse kick to the dinosaur, which ultimately doesn't work out. So then eventually he just runs away from it. So we are very much more realizing that these dinosaurs are coming back alive because justifiably, it seems that there desperately needs to be rangers. We have it to where Tommy is going about his own route, and without a doubt, we have it to where the Power Rangers end up very much running from some Mesagog-like minions, which ultimately leads them into a cave that otherwise makes them eventually find out this like secret hidden part of this cave that ultimately leads them into some kind of underground facility that is very much looking like a command center. So they eventually end up finding these power crystals, and ultimately they otherwise decide it's like, well, hey, like, it seems like this stuff that is here looks very valuable. So if anything, maybe we can bribe Dr. Tommy Oliver with any number of these things so we can get out of det- detention permanently, because ultimately we definitely need to get back to our regular lives, because all of us have much more important things to do than just sit around to be in detention. Because of course Connor is very much wanting to, of course, like, get into the upper echelons of soccer and be drafted by some team, and Ethan is of course wanting to go into computer club, and Kira of course just wants to keep playing somewhere. So we eventually have it to where each one of these people take these power crystals without knowing any better, and so they eventually leave, eventually re-meeting up with Tommy, and eventually having to fight off some of these Mesogog minions. And eventually Tommy is realizing that these kids had gotten these crystals because ultimately every single one of them were all displaying forms of power. So, and Tommy knows full well what all they were going to do. So eventually, when it gets down to it, ultimately we have it to where we have the kids eventually, at some point later on, ending up needing to talk to Tommy at some point. And so they end up going to his home, eventually going further into his home to realize that Tommy, quote unquote, has a Batcave going on. Batcave meaning that ultimately that same command center like setup that all three of these kids have gone into, they realized that this entire command center was actually underneath Tommy Oliver's home the entire time. So basically, Tommy has a bat cave. So I thought that moment was just kind of funny. I'm like, so like Tommy has been brewing up to be a Power Ranger for I don't know how long, and like why is he waited to this moment to eventually like take this time to otherwise be a ranger again? Because leaving if eventually leaving being a Power Ranger to ultimately be a doctor, I'm like, so like he really desperately wanted to just go through college and eventually be a doctor, but then turn around and then eventually just be a Power Ranger again. Yeah, it ends up being what it is. So we have it to where eventually Connor at first wants to give up being a Power Ranger because he would much rather be a soccer player. But eventually he comes to a fruition like moment that saving the day is a much more like rewarding thing than being on a soccer team. So eventually he ends up like staying with being a Power Ranger. So we ultimately have it to where all three of these Power Rangers eventually make it to seemingly this establishment of sorts that ultimately has a owner of it that is otherwise tied to Tommy, and eventually this owner ends up telling these three people like, hey, like, Ethan, isn't there something that you could do with our business? Hey, is like um, hey Connor, isn't there some kind of team that you could ultimately be drafted to? Hey, Kira, isn't like ultimately we can really use some music in this place in this restaurant. How about you go ahead and um, sing tonight? because it seems that Tommy has relayed this message to this girl, and otherwise she is the girl that is going to be setting up every single one of these people to like get jobs and stuff like that, because ultimately they're Power Rangers. Why not have something on the side justifiably? So we have it to, and this girl consistently keeps ending up being with Tommy, because she is otherwise just a tech person that otherwise is, well, not just a tech person, but she is very much knowledgeable and really has ended up assisting Tommy through numerous portions of time and this and that. So they ultimately have it to where at some points that the Rangers end up going through several kind of different portions of this and that. They end up going through, like, there's one episode where they end up via one villain, they end up drastically changing their personalities, and we find out all along that there is some like dormant thing within them that is going to make them realize that like Connor's actually a real smart person, that ultimately Ethan is much more like athletic, and then Kira is just kind of much more, I guess, intellectual, I guess. Like, I don't know anything really about her that kind of makes her any really very much different than what she normally knows what is. But anyways, because this episode leads us into, let's talk about Trent. So Trent is kind of this guy that ultimately is otherwise a adopted kid into the arms of Mesagog. Because ultimately Mesagog really is a normal human being at some portion of time, but then he eventually changes into Mesagog. So Trent doesn't know about Mesagog. He just knows that he has a dad that adopted him, and surefire enough. So Trent eventually tries to get work at this restaurant, and it seems like eventually things are starting to really go south for Trent, and eventually it gets to the point to where ultimately, like, Trent is consistently morphing into this ranger, and he doesn't understand why. It's starting to turn out like a werewolf-like situation for Trent, which I thoroughly do enjoy. But eventually this werewolf meets the Power Rangers, aka the White Ranger meets these Power Rangers, and ultimately is very much clashing. Trent can't really control what is going on, and ultimately he's left to be a victim. And ultimately nobody really knows that it is Trent right away. Eventually they come to the consensus that Trent eventually has to confess to the people who are Power Rangers that ultimately he is the White Ranger, and then he's like, he can't control all of this, and that ultimately he needs help. Eventually, slowly but surely, once they realize that Trent does have some good in him, and ultimately are now convinced that they need to try to help him, they slowly but surely turn him on the side of good to ultimately be one of their Rangers. And then so also, eventually Tommy quite easily decides to otherwise be a Power Ranger as well. He, of course, ends up taking on the Black Ranger, which is kind of interesting. So we have it to where his colors are black and gold. And I'm like, was it the show's purpose of having a Power Ranger who comes back has to wear black and gold? Because we have Jason, who ends up coming back in Zeo, and of course he wears black and gold. So now that Tommy comes back and he is wearing black and gold, was that like a purpose all along to have him not only stick out, but then have him be the veteran Esh-like character that is coming back, so he has to wear black and gold? ultimately, like, it's easily nice that like, what if like the girl that was astronomer that ends up coming back to be a Power Ranger, what if her colors were black and gold? Um, Even though she really wasn't a Power Ranger all along, she eventually turns to be a villain and then comes back to be a Ranger. And what if her colors were black and gold, but instead she just ends up being a Pink Ranger at some portion of this and that. And so eventually she comes back to do one big appearance when they have like the legendary event, the legendary battle where you have all the Power Rangers coming back and they're all there, showcasing that, hey, look at me, I'm here again. Let's crank out that fat check. So, anyways, yeah, we have it to where ultimately within this we have the Power Rangers who eventually, very much more now, having seemingly 5 Rangers to their mix. And ultimately, yeah, there's some interesting episodes where ultimately we have this journey of letting everybody know that Tommy is back and that Tommy is like he's what's the word? He's still got it. Like they have to kind of prove to you like yeah, Tommy's here and he's still kicking. He's still doing well. And like I think that's kind of the hilarious thing is like, dude, this guy is still in ridiculously amazing shape. So and will always be until eventually he probably just realizes that it's like not like I'm not gonna come back to Power Rangers yet again to do some kind of appearance or whatever he eventually wants to do is whatever he wants to do. I think at some point they are gearing up to eventually probably cast his daughter probably in some role, and surefire enough that would easily make a ton of sense to eventually have his daughter be a ranger at some point, because reasonably I'm assuming more than likely she's going to have the Oliver name, and surefire enough. So going into this, yeah, there's a lot of feature stuff that I'm bringing up, but I'm not bringing up much of the episodes. There is a very interesting Shark Ash-like character that looked very interesting to me. There were some characters that looked very much like luchador, like Mexican wrestler Ash in some episodes. Reasonably, like, if anything, yeah, there's some very interesting villains in these episodes, but really when looking at them, like, really the entire thing is the story of the journey of these characters, and that's all that's really to put to the forefront. Like, the monsters are just kind of like an icing on top of the cake to get people to fight something and then eventually call the Zords to eventually sword this thing down. So going into this, I think that's all that I wanted to go out of my way to say for these 15 episodes. Again, Dino Thunder is really interesting and or good journey going on to this, and eventually I hope that people will enjoy this show for wanting me to go into several other Power Rangers seasons more in depthly. I ultimately just coincidentally was like going into this going, hey, how about I just start watching this? And then I found out that it was like popular on Netflix. So I'm like, okay, I guess it's like, and plus I was already like watching the show regardless. And then ultimately I was like, oh, hey, it's popular on Netflix. Okay, I'll watch it. So I just ended up going into it and just enjoying it. So at the end of the day, I think this review was kind of clustered with a ton of tangents and a bunch of other stuff, but I enjoy the series and I hope to go into it more. It seems like these 15 episodes end with Tommy being unable to demorph. And so recently we're going to have a stretch of time where Tommy is actually just going to be the Black Ranger, but then I guess eventually he's going to be doing some voiceover work uh, till eventually he can be used on the show again. because this show ends up trying to creatively, if there's some rangers that can't be like there all the time, it's like, okay, well, how about we just do this and then add in add in Tommy later, or add in like have this story be done, and that'll just be thumbs up good enough. So yeah, that's all I want to say about this show so far. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this review. I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.